Well, welcome to another edition of the podcast. The podcast is called Hank Unplugged, and we're now well into doing podcasts. The first one was with Frederica Matthews Green. I talked about my conversion to Orthodoxy and all things Orthodox. Welcome to the Orthodox Church, so to speak. In other words, what is Orthodoxy? A lot of people simply don't know. They put it in a category that might even be cultic because they don't know what Orthodoxy is. So, again, we talked about all things Orthodox. It was a fascinating discussion. And then I had on the most interesting man in the world, at least that's what I call him, Rod Dreher, as he talked about a strategy for Christians living in a post-Christian nation. I've also had Frank Beckwith on. He's been a friend for over 30 years. One of the greatest, well, just in general, one of the greatest apologists, but one of the great Catholic apologists, who is a philosopher, a thinker, he's a writer, one of the most brilliant minds in the Christian world today, a professor at Baylor University. And then I had on Joe Dallas. We talked about human sexuality. No one knows that subject like Joe Dallas. Today's podcast is no exception. My guest today is going to be Raymond Ibrahim. And Raymond is a unique individual. He's got an encyclopedic knowledge of Islam. He's a Coptic Christian born and raised in America. He speaks fluent Arabic. And he's a Shillman Fellow at the David Horowitz Freedom Center. He's an Associate Fellow at the Middle East Forum. He's been all over the news, particularly of late. He has his own website, RaymondIbrahim.com, and we're going to have a fascinating discussion. But I want to start it out by reading a quote from Malcolm Muggeridge. It sort of sets the tone in terms of what's happening in the West. Raymond is going to fill us in on what's happening in the East, but this quote from Malcolm Muggeridge, of course, he was a 20th century British journalist, he was a satirist, he was a broadcaster. He became a devout follower of Jesus Christ in his 60s, and as such, a fierce defender of the faith. But he said something I think is worth starting this podcast out with. He said that whereas other civilizations have been brought down by attacks of barbarians from without, our civilization has that unique distinction of training its own destroyers at its own educational institutions and then providing them with facilities for propagating their destructive ideologies, all at public expense. Thus said Muggeridge, did Western man decide to abolish himself, creating his own boredom out of his own affluence, his own vulnerability out of his own strength, his own impotence out of his own erotomania, himself blowing the trumpet that brought the walls of his own city tumbling down, and having convinced himself that he was too numerous, labored with pill and scalpel and syringe to make himself fewer, until at last, having educated himself into imbecility and polluted and drugged himself into stupefaction, he keeled over, a weary, battered, old brontosaurus, and became extinct. And I bring this up because we ought to note that filling the vacuum that has been left by dying, aborted Westerners are polygamous Muslims who have little or no intent on assimilation into Western culture. And while this is going on in the West, mass genocide is taking place in the East. And I don't know of anyone who has written about this more eloquently than my guest on this podcast, Raymond Ibrahim. His book, Crucified Again, Exposing Islam's New War on Christians, is an absolute must in terms of reading. But here's someone who is fluent in Arabic, someone who knows what's going on in the Middle East. And I am just delighted, Raymond, to have you on this podcast as we sort of talk about things that people aren't talking about and should be talking about.
Hi, Hank. I'm very happy to be with you, and thank you for that excellent introduction, as well as that quote you just read, because actually it pertains so much to so much that's going on in the world, but especially to this question of Islam and its interaction with the West and other civilizations and Christians and so forth. That Western civilization is so unique in that it is the only one that so actively works to undermine itself. This is precisely what happens with the question of Islam. Right now I'm working my newest book, which is titled Sword and Scimitar, and it'll be coming out sometime in 2018, is a military history of Islam and the West, which, of course, the West is a new name. Most civilizations aren't named after a geographical location. So the West, of course, used to be Christendom up until very recently. So that's what the history is about. But the point is, when you look at it, I've always known this, and this is why I wanted to write the book. But the more research I've done, the more even I have been surprised to find out just how parallel what groups like ISIS or the Islamic State are doing, how parallel and how much they mirror what Islamic sultans and caliphs and, whirling dervishes even have done for almost 14 centuries against Europe and Christian civilization. It's identical. It's actually much worse. And so the point here is, here we are saying ISIS has nothing to do with Islam. Islam means peace, and so forth. And, we can get into the theological argument, and I think a lot of people have done that, including myself, whereby we show how, so-called Islamic radicals are actually justified by the words of the Quran, by the words of Muhammad, and so forth. But it's actually more mind-boggling to me to witness the history, which is just identical, unwavering, one long 14th century ISIS attack on Europe, constant, which has been, and so the reason I say this again is if you go into a history class today, whether it's in college, whether it's, of course, in public schools and so forth, all of it has been whitewashed. You're going to get one sentence about how Islam basically expanded, and then you're going to get a lot of hoopla about how it's one of the Abrahamic faiths, and basically it's so close to Judaism and Christianity, and really there is no real disagreement, and if there ever has been conflict, it's been a misunderstanding, and so forth. And people believe this, and this is why they can sit back. They've been indoctrinated by, as you read in that quote, they've been indoctrinated by themselves and by their own institutions and by their own intellectuals into believing the exact reverse of what happened historically. And that's why we can sit here today and we're mind-boggled about this phenomena of ISIS, and we're all trying to distance it from Islam, and it doesn't make sense, and why did it happen now? When in reality, it is just a continuation of a 14th century jihad, unwavering jihad, on the West and on other civilizations. But we don't know that because we have actively undermined ourselves from the educational institutions, from Hollywood, of course, and movies, or from the churches and preachers who talk about Islam and true history. And so here we are, completely paralyzed by ourselves.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting when you talk about what's going on in terms of history. We should go back to the beginnings and talk about Muhammad versus Christ, because one of the things I picked up in what you just said is that many people, as you correctly note, are thinking that Islam is one of the three great Abrahamic religions, and do not understand that this is a cult of both Judaism and Christianity. It's an aberration of both. When I was at the University of Tehran, in Iran in Alma-Tibetaba, the sociology university, this is one of the things I heard over and over again. We are one of the great Abrahamic faiths. And they were communicating this in a collegial fashion to me. But the reality is, this is an aberration of both Judaism and Christianity. Expand on that a little bit.
Oh, absolutely. And in fact, the main point of what you're saying, people will always tell us what you're saying right now, which is, oh, this is one of the Abrahamic faiths. The problem with that line of reasoning is it's formulated by secular minds that just do not comprehend what it means to have faith and religion. And so so Judaism comes along, and we have the Torah, the Pentateuch, basically what we call the Old Testament. Christians accept it as it is. They've taken it. It is the same, Bible, the Old Testament, that the Jews traditionally have used. So we don't say Abraham did something different than what Jews said, and we don't say Moses did something differently. And then, of course, there's a New Testament, and there's a disagreement, of course, between Judaism and Christianity. But what Islam did, as you said, is not just mix and match and create its own narrative. But to give you an analogy, if I have, let's say, a family, I have a revered family that I love, and my ancestors that I know, and I know their stories, I know their names, I know what they did, and they're mine. Now, other people who are not related to me, well, okay, so that's what he says. That's his family. Good for him. We have nothing to do with it. But what Muslims basically did, it's like they came along and said, yeah, we love that family that you have. And that's the point that, seculars make. Like, you see, you guys are similar. But then they don't just love the family that we have, and they don't just build on it. They've changed their names. They've changed what this family has said, what this family has done. And so I ask you, I have a family and I have an ancestry that I'm proud of, who am I actually going to be more understanding with? A group like, let's say, to keep the analogy going, Hindus or Buddhists who have nothing to do with this ancestry and don't say anything against or for it, or a group that comes and basically appropriates it, changes their names, changes what they did, changes what they stand for. The Islamic Jesus, Isa, is going to come back and break all the crosses, kill all the pigs, and attack Christians because they made him the son of God, for example. So you can see that when one group, what Muslims have done is not by highlighting the same characters from the Old and New Testament, that doesn't make them closer. If anything, that creates contention between them and both Jews and Christians, because they've taken their holy people and they've changed them around and they've said this is who and what they are. So actually, because of that, we are in big arguments and contradiction. But the secular mind presents it all as just kind of, throws it all in one bowl. Oh, look, they also believe in Abraham and Jesus, and so let's all sing, hold hands and be happy. And they miss the more subtle aspect of actually creating a very large rift by appropriating such prophets and peoples.
Yeah, and then you have, I think this probably is part of the discussion as well. I mean, you talk to so many people that don't know a whole lot about Christianity today, or a lot of people that certainly don't know a whole lot about Islam, but in their minds, there's sort of an equation or a parallel between the two. And I think it's helpful probably for those listening into our conversation to underscore the difference between Mohammed and Christ. I mean, in some ways, we talk about two different Mohammeds. There was a Meccan Mohammed just as there was a Medinan Mohammed. But you look at the Medinan Mohammed, and he is a ruthless warlord. You look at Christ, and he's one that said, put away the sword, he who lives by the sword is going to die by the sword. The distinction or the chasm or the distance between Christ and Mohammed seems to be one of infinity, and yet they're talked about like they're sort of parallel leaders and have a lot in common.
Exactly, and that's part of the ongoing effort to make everything relative, basically to neutralize and take Christianity down and raise Islam up. And, you just say they're the same. But as you noted, the character of Christ and the character of Muhammad are essentially antithetical to one another. They are the difference between night and day, black and white, right and wrong. And I don't say this as a Christian. I say this very objectively, that if you have any sorts of ethics or a set of moral standards, and you look at the things that Jesus said, and you compare and contrast it with the things that Muhammad did, this is just black and white difference. There's nothing whatsoever close about them. One tells you to forgive your enemy and to pray for those who persecute you, and one says kill and maim and rape and enslave anyone who doesn't accept your God. That's a vast difference. As for the Mecca-Medina dichotomy, yes, you're correct. The Mecca verses or surahs of the Quran, or basically, to those who are unfamiliar, the Quran was believed by Muslims to have been revealed, quote unquote, in two phases. The first phase, the older phase, the original phase, is when Muhammad was living in Mecca. He was essentially outnumbered and weak. He had less than a handful of followers who believed him. And he's very much in this period like an Old Testament prophet who's just basically preaching fire and brimstone and threatening people to believe in the one God and to et cetera, et cetera. And largely the Meccan verses that appear at this period are the ones that the apologists for Islam will pick and choose from to show you the tolerance aspects of Islam. So within those verses, you have things such as you have your religion and I have mine, implying that, each one can believe their own way. And then Muhammad went to Medina. He became a political leader, and he grew in strength significantly, and then went on the war path, which essentially consisted of caravan raids for booty and plunder, and the Quran's pretty clear about that. Now, in this context, we got what's called the Medinan revelations. Now, these are remarkably different than the Meccan ones. Now, it's basically a manual for how to raid and plunder, and but surrounded in the garb of religious language. It's being done for God and God's sake, or Allah, and so forth. And this is where you have verses like Quran 9 and 929, which says, fight the people of the book, which is Islam's name for Christians and Jews specifically, until they pay jizya, that's the word used, which means tribute in exchange for their lives, so they buy their lives, and feel themselves humbled and subdued. And that actually is the cornerstone verse for the very concept of dhimma, or as we call it in English, dhimmitude, whereby the Jews and Christians and those who are under Islamic authority, who are infidels, must feel humbled, must pay tribute, must be basically thankful they're even allowed to live and exist. And then what happened is when the Islamic jurists and the articulators of what's called Sharia, Islamic law, looked at the Quran to derive laws, they noticed this difference. There is a contradiction in the Quran. So what they came up with is this, what in English we call abrogation, which means if there's a contradiction in the Quran, one verse says you have your religion, I have mine, and then all of a sudden another verse calls on Muslims to fight Christians and Jews, what do we do? And so they concluded that the newer verses always abrogate and cancel out the older verses. So the Meccan verses were applicable during that time only, and also applicable today when Muslims find themselves in a similar situation as Muhammad. So if Muslims are living in America, which is infidel majority, just like Muhammad was when he was living in Mecca and he was living under pagans and he was outnumbered, they should preach that Islam means peace. They should preach, you have your religion, I have mine. That is acceptable and expected. Once Muslims, however, are like Muhammad in his Medina period, stronger and able to do so, then they should go on the war path and abrogate the former peaceful position that they had and that they voiced. So that is actually what I've just described as the mainstream understanding of how Islamic law is articulated and the current position of so-called infidels, specifically Christians and Jews, who must be fought against whenever possible until they are subdued and pay tribute.
Talk about a law, because this is kind of, it's certainly one of these things that is confusing to most people. First of all, people say that the Allah of Islam is the Allah of Christianity or the God of Christianity. But I suppose if you get down to brass tacks, Allah is the alter ego of Muhammad. Even Aisha, his child bride, said somewhere along the line, it seems like a law is willing to give you whatever you want. In other words, it seems like every time you want to do something that might be untoward, all of a sudden a revelation comes down from a law and sanctions it. The idea of a law seems to me to be fictional and have nothing to do with divinity whatsoever. Because if it did, why would you need the abrogations that you talk about, and why are there such great distinctions between the Medinan Quran and the Meccan Quran?
Absolutely. Well, as to your first point, is Allah God? And again, this is a byproduct of this sort of Western secular approach to religions, lumping them all together. Just like when they say, "Oh, look, Islam talks about Abraham and Muhammad and Jesus." Well, that's a good thing. Well, not really, because they've created different characters and said that the ones that exist in the Bible are false. So it's the same with Allah. If Allah is God, then he's schizophrenic, because the God of the Bible says things that counter 100% what Allah says in the Quran. So in my mind, these are different deities. That's absolutely for sure, because otherwise it's a schizophrenic God we're talking about. As to your point about Aisha, yes, that's a very well-known anecdote, and in fact, lots of Muslims who have apostatized, former Muslims, point to it. And to give listeners more detail, what happened is Muhammad. There's some story that happened, and essentially women started giving themselves up to Muhammad for sexual relations. And so Muhammad came up with a verse. He said, Allah has revealed to me a new verse, and this verse is in the Quran, and it basically says that the strictures placed on the average Muslim male, whereby he only has 4 wives, do not apply to Muhammad. He can have more wives, and he can do this sort of thing. And that's when his young child bride Aisha said exactly what you said, and she just kind of quipped and said, "It's interesting how your God always kind of validates your fancies with revelations," and so many Muslims point to that. And furthermore, it's most people don't know this, but if you look at the early literature, the history of the earliest Christians, especially the Byzantines or of the Eastern Roman Empire, and the Syriacs and the Copts who lived under Islamic rule in the 7th and 8th centuries, when they finally got the Quran and the biography of Muhammad, they were scandalized at what they came across. And they said exactly what you're saying, which is, what sort of a God is this that exists basically to validate this man's most primordial and savage impulses for rapine and for rape and women and for plunder and for warfare? And they said, and they always highlighted especially the sexual discrepancies. For example, there's in the Quran, and this is probably the most remarked on or criticized by Christian theologians throughout the centuries, beginning in the 7th centuries. In the Quran, there's a story where, it's the context is given in the Hadith, but basically Muhammad saw his adopted sons. He went into his adopted son's tent and saw his wife, Zainab, I believe, uncovered, and so he became very attracted to her. And then when his adopted son found out about this, he felt bad, and he essentially divorced his wife to give her up to Muhammad, and Muhammad married her. And in the Quran there's a verse which explains all this, and it says it's very similar to the other one, which Muhammad is above and beyond reproach. What Muslim men can do, Muhammad can do more. He's not limited to anything, et cetera, et cetera. And in the context of this, in fact, Islam came to outlaw adoption because part of the rationale was, well, he was never his real son, and you shouldn't be adopting, and so forth. And it gets very convoluted. Anyway, this is what Christian theologians, as well as Muslims who apostatized, have always looked at and were scandalized at and said, is it not obvious to you people what a fraud this is? And from there, we can understand why it is that Islam is a religion of violence and force, why it has to impose its faith, and why it's the only religion that threatens those who leave it with death. Because if it didn't, it would not exist right now, because everyone would have left it by now.
This must drive you crazy, Raymond. As a Coptic Christian, you would use the word Allah. And the meaning that you pour into that word is completely different than the meaning that a Muslim would pour into the word. So help people understand that it's the same word, but the meaning poured into the word by a Coptic Christian or a Christian in the Middle East would be very, very different from the meaning poured into that word by a Muslim.
Sure. Well, historically, the Copts and all the other, the Syriacs and the Assyrians and all these Christian communities who dominated the Middle East before the advent and conquest of Islam had their own language and had their own word for God. But increasingly, their languages, the Coptic language, for example, I believe it's around the 14th or 15th century under the Mamluks, was outlawed on pain of getting your tongue cut off. And you had to speak Arabic. And so in the context of speaking only Arabic, and of course in the context of as a dhimmi who doesn't want to draw any attention to yourselves, Arab-speaking Christians just adopted the word Allah. So it was, advantageous for them to say, yes, I believe in Allah like you do. And it's even funny when you see the debates. Oftentimes Christians are very happy to say the first part of the Shahada, the Islamic creed, which is there is no God but Allah. But they hesitate and they try to dissemble and get away from the second part, which is, and Muhammad is his prophet. Because once you say that, of course, then you have to accept the Quran and the Hadith and so forth. So it was a sort of, diplomatic maneuvering for them to simply exist and try to lessen their persecution. But absolutely, when any Middle Eastern Christian or Arab-speaking Christian says Allah, and they do, the Arabic Bible uses the word Allah and so forth, the God they have in mind is the Christian God, the God that English speaker peoples call God with a capital G. And again, based on the way that God is portrayed in the scriptures of Christians is so fundamentally different than the way the God, Allah, of Islam is portrayed. These are different characters. And for us to say they're the same, then we have to accept that it's a schizophrenic God we're dealing with.
You mentioned that word jizya earlier on, and for a lot of people, that's sort of a foreign word, don't really know what you're talking about. But I suppose we could say, in common parlance, it's sort of like a gangster racket. And the reason I bring this up is it seems to me that a lot of people become Muslims because it's convenient. They don't want to pay the jizya. They don't want to pay the poll tax. They want to just forgo that. They're sort of secular in their leanings anyway, and no harm, no foul. I'll just become a Muslim, and it's a whole lot less expensive.
Oh, yeah. Historically, the only very committed Christians and Jews and other people of whatever other faiths under Islam remained in that religion. When they did so, they knew that they are suffering social disadvantages. They're being they had to pay extortion money, which is this jizya, and so forth. And so anybody, in as much as how much faith you had in Christianity, or how much you want to just get along and improve your lots in society, you would convert to Islam. Once you convert to Islam, then the jizya tax is abolished. You are now superior to any infidel around you. This is why today we see in Pakistan and Egypt, for example, any Muslim can go and just accuse this Christian of blaspheming Muhammad, and all of a sudden that Christian is thrown in jail, possibly killed, burned alive, and so forth. And everyone knows that more often than not, when Muslims do this, it's just for a personal vendetta. But they know they have this sort of social privilege, and they use it, and they exploit it, and Islam gives it to them. Islam says in a court of law, an infidel's word is half the value of a Muslim. So if it's my word against yours, I'm a Muslim, you're not, then your case closed, I win. So obviously lots of people, and aside from that, I've always seen, a lot of people think, especially the context or the idea of jihad, that those who do jihad and those who attack and kill and rape and plunder infidels are essentially religious fanatics who believe they're going to die and go to heaven. I actually believe that there's a small core that fits that description. The overwhelming majority, and I've seen this from my studies in history, and I see it now, did it because jihad is simply a very useful mechanism to allow them, to justify them to kill, rob, and murder the other. The religious minority in society. So it's not that. So again, if you look at Pakistan or Egypt or these countries that have Christians, and you will find often Christian girls are abducted and raped, Christians are robbed and plundered. Now the Muslims who do this are not necessarily religious. However, they are banking on the fact that their religion makes a clear distinction between Muslims and infidels. And in fact, Islamic law teaches never can a Muslim side with an infidel against a fellow Muslim. And for that very reason, religious minorities have been and continue to be attacked, because the people who attack them, not necessarily religious, but they know the authorities are not going to pursue them, because if they do, then they can play the Islamic card, accuse them of being apostates, they're siding with infidels, look, I'm a good Muslim, etc., etc. So Islam, in fact, does come with a lot of benefits, very sordid and artificial benefits for those who join it against those who resist it and maintain their religious identity.
Yeah, this is one of the things, and I'm circling back to something you said earlier. I mean, Islam has for 14 centuries advanced by the sword. And the moment you make that kind of comment in polite company, people are immediately going to say, or it seems like, this is the mantra that comes back at you at least, is, well, yeah, but that's what Christianity does as well. It doesn't just advance by the word, it also advances by the sword. I mean, think, for example, about the Crusades or these kinds of things, and you immediately see that there's a bloody edge to Christianity as well. How do you clarify that canard?
Well, Hank, I'm clarifying it right now by writing this book, The Sword and Scimitar, because this book is exactly written in my mind as an antidote to just what you said. I'm basically laying out the history of the conflict between Islam and Christianity. I'm showing that it starts off with Islamic attacks on the Eastern Roman Byzantine Empire, which was the closest to it, and then essentially in 1 century, Islam had overrun, conquered all of North Africa, from Egypt in the east to Spain, had entered into Spain and conquered Spain, and was now in France attacking. Now, some people may know that very generically. They just know, Islam and the Arabs rapidly spread in a century. They don't know how it was done. They don't read the details. All of that is in all these old, musty books, many of them not even translated, intentionally so. And this is what I've essentially marshaled and put into place to show you that, no, actually what they did is what ISIS did. They went into these places, they burned churches, they broke crosses, they raped nuns, they put the sword to them, they said you convert or you die. Then they extorted them for money until there's anecdotes of Christians in Egypt that were reduced to starvation and basically gave their children away rather than be killed and have their children killed, and so forth. In North Africa, there's anecdotes, right there in that early first few decades of the Arab conquest, of literally hundreds of thousands of slaves being herded across North Africa and taken to the harems of the caliph in Medina and so forth. And so, I spent 3 chapters documenting all that and showing, and if anything, all that time, there's 2 successes, which was the famous Battle of Tours or Poitiers in 732, which essentially stopped the Arab advance, and that was in the west, and the lesser known but probably more important, siege of Constantinople in 717, and essentially Constantinople prevailed, came out of it unscathed, and wasn't conquered. Now, if either of those 2, one in the east and in the west, were conquered, it's very plausible to believe Islam, the whole history would have changed by now. There may not have been a Western world. There may not have been a Christendom. All of Europe could have been the northwestern appendage of the Islamic world. And then, finally, halfway through the book, we come to the Crusades. And, again, I document because that is the fact. They were done in 100% as a response to these 4 centuries previous of nonstop conquest. And the most recent conquest or advance that the Muslims had done was the Battle of Manzikert in 1071. And that's why the Crusades come 1095, 24 years later. They had now overrun all of Asia Minor. They were essentially threatening Constantinople again, Jerusalem. All the pilgrims were being killed and raped. And so it was in that context, and the Pope and the Crusaders make it very clear that's why they're going to fight the Muslims, not because they're they're portrayed now as some sort of prototypical white colonizers going to disrupt the peaceful Middle East. I know that's the popular narrative by people like Karen Armstrong and so forth, and that's why I'm trying to set the record straight. So when you really look at the full history, you find out there's nothing to apologize for. There's absolutely no difference I mean, there's absolutely no relationship between crusade and jihad, because one was an unprovoked offensive in the name of jihad, and one was 100% done in defensive measure. It's the same thing with the Reconquista, which few people know about. And if you read the literature, Spain was conquered and was held for almost 800 years by Muslims. But from the very start, there was a small resistance up in the north in the mountains of Christians, of the indigenous Christians and the descendants of the Goths. And they continued fighting and fighting and advancing until 1492, when they, took the whole of Spain back from Islam. Now, you read what they say, it's 100% just a defensive war, basically reclaiming our lost, stolen land. And you look at when Islam, it's amazing to me, sometimes I watch documentaries about Islam in Spain, the wonders of Cordoba. And it will never occur to anyone who watches a show like that, or even reads books, that when Islam entered Spain, it was just a massacre. There's the rape of nuns and destruction of churches, forcing everything we're accustomed to, forcing them to convert, massacring them, taking tens and thousands into slavery. You won't get that. You'll just hear Islam was introduced in Spain in the 7th century. And then the next sentence is about all these architectural glories in Cordoba and supposedly some sort of culture of, convivencia and Jews and Muslims and Christians getting along, all of which is absolute bunk. And a good book, if you're interested, is The Myth of Andalusia by Professor Dario Fernandez, which shows you all that, too, is nonsense. So, I'm glad you bring this up, because I think the historical record needs to be straightened up and set right. Because, like you said, whenever we talk about this, all of a sudden you're going to get in your face, well, what about the Crusades? What about this? And the only reason people say that is because they've been so misinformed, going back to your opening quote, by, the intelligentsia and our own, institutions, that they think now it's once again been made to be relative. Jihad is relative and the same thing as Crusades, just like Allah and God are the same thing, just like, the prophets of Islam in the Quran are the same as the one in the New Testament. No, they're so different, and people need to get the facts straight.
You talk about the myth of the Andalusian Paradise, and I think that bears some elaboration, because this is a myth that I have heard over and over again, and it's not by the average person. I mean, you're talking about people like Barack Obama pointing to this myth. You're talking about Carly Fiorina when she was running for president of the United States. You're talking about so many luminaries, educated Western people who repeat this myth over and over again, ad nauseum, ad infinitum. My question sometimes is this just a function of stakeholder interest? Is this a function of sloppy research? Is this simply trying to what's going on in terms of the people? These are smart people. How can they be so fooled by something that Snopes could uncover in a moment?
Well, ultimately you have to lay blame at all these academics and prestigious scholars from prestigious universities who publish books saying all this stuff. And so, it's harder for me to blame an Obama who maybe he read one of these books and he goes, okay, well, this is a well-known writer. It must be true. I really hold the academics accountable, but really the deeper genesis of this sort of thinking, I trace it sort of to the Enlightenment, or so-called Enlightenment, which really had a very most people think it was an anti-Catholic sentiment, but I think it was an anti-Christian sentiment. And so everywhere, and you see this in the writings of Edward Gibbon, he tries always, and others follow him, wherever you can find, Muslims or non-Christians doing anything that could in any way be shown as at least neutral or even good, it is just blown out of proportion and juxtaposed as a way to sort of shame Christians and show how backwards they are, how whatever they are. And this is, Voltaire and Gibbon, and this kind of thinking has gone on and on. It's only gotten worse by, academics who just are convinced that historically Christianity was this retrogressive, horrible, oppressive force. And in order to validate that, I think that's their first premise. I think that's their most the point they're most interested in making. And in order to validate it, what they do is they look for different civilizations and peoples and try to present them as, so much more enlightened, so much more progressive, okay? And so so they came to the period of Spain where Islam was in it, and there is, in Islam's 800 years of presence in Spain, there's about 30 years, and that's what they're talking about. There's 30 years where you had a couple of caliphs who, the whole Dhimma thing was still in order. If you're a Christian or Jew, you're paying Jizya. You're a second-class citizen. But there was a much opulence. There's the building of grand architecture. You had doctors and scientists working, most of whom were Christians or Jews or recently converted to Islam, Christians and Jews. And they've taken that, okay, and pulled it out, even though the larger history of Islam in Spain is constant carnage, war, and savagery, especially with the coming of two groups. One's the Almohads and the other is the Almorabitun, which were, these groups that came from North Africa were basically Berbers, or as they were called, Moors, would make ISIS look like Boy Scouts. And they were fundamentally Islamic, and they came just killing Christians left and right. And they came on the behest and being called by the Andalusian Muslims once they saw that they were losing to the Christians. So basically, they found one little anecdote, which in and of itself, if it was something that Christians had done in history, would be absolutely nothing to warrant any kind of praise. But because it's Muslims, it's been taken and just augmented and exaggerated beyond reality. And then all these books were written, and every book builds atop the other book. And now you have basically, as we call it, it's a myth, the myth of Andalusia. It's not even real. If you look at the historical records as written by Christians and Muslims living in Spain, it was conflict that generally prevailed. And Muslims were there as occupiers because they had invaded it, just like they invaded Egypt and Anatolia and so forth. And yet, so when you bring this up, I'm glad you do, because it really shows you, again, how warped our idea and understanding of history is. And it's intentionally, going back to your first quote you opened, it's intentionally been crafted and fabricated in this way to create a false impression that never even existed.
You talk about some false impressions that are being created, and I don't think you and I have ever talked about this, but let me run this by you. I hear, whether it's Fox News or it's MSNBC or whatever it is, I always hear this moniker, radical Islam. At least now more and more people are using the moniker, but it seems to me that what you're saying, Raymond, is that all of this is not radical Islam. It sounds more like run-of-the-mill Islam.
Yeah, it's mainstream Islam. The adjective radical has been placed there to imply, there's something weird or strange about it. And so, we're given the dichotomy of moderate Muslim or just Muslim, which implies moderate, and then radical Islamist. Okay, I don't mind making a distinction between Muslims because, yes, as we already mentioned, there's a lot of Muslims who are just Muslims because they live in Muslim countries and they just want to make do. It's not even that they believe in the Quran or anything, okay? And those do tend to be moderate, okay? But for me, a true Muslim, if you look at that word, Muslim in Arabic means it's connected to Islam. Islam in Arabic and Muslim, they're conjugates of one word. And Islam means submit. Muslim means one who has submitted, okay? So what is it they're submitting to? They're submitting to what's known as Sharia, basically all these laws that have been promulgated supposedly by Allah, or more realistically by Muhammad, and by the schools of law and so forth. So if you get a Muslim, so-called, who, let's say he drinks and is and doesn't fast, and he's a cool guy that lives next door and you hang out with him, and he goes to parties. Well, he's not a Muslim because he's not following the laws of Allah, right? And he hangs out with Christians and Jews and he kind of likes them. Well, that's the Muslim we talk about. We say he's a great guy. But in fact, he doesn't even warrant to be called a Muslim because he is actually defying Allah's laws, including do not befriend the Christians and Jews, which is verbatim in the Quran. So for me, the radical I would call the so-called radical Muslim a Muslim. Or a Muslim, and I would call what we call a moderate Muslim, I would call them cultural or nominal Muslims. People who are just born into it. They celebrate Ramadan. They don't even go to mosque. They don't pray or do 5 prayers and so forth. So yeah, there's that distinction. But the radical one, or the ones that we call radical, are the real ones. They are the ones who have submitted to Allah. And in fact, the word radical, the English word radical, implies going to the root and the essence of something. And it's not a bad thing if you're radical. It actually, that's the connotation, I think, in English, that it's bad. But it only means something being very true and being very pure to its essence. And so to me, okay, the radicals are the real Muslims. They're living it. They're doing it. And again, from a historical point of view, of course, there was no radical moderate distinction. That was just created now to try to, make sense of all this and say, no, there's good Muslims and bad Muslims, and most of them are good. Historically, all the stuff, think of the horrors that ISIS has done. All of that is mainstream and standard. Never once was it portrayed by either medieval Muslims or medieval Christians as some sort of aberration in Islam. That's just what Islam does.
Kind of sounds like when Obama called ISIL or ISIS the JV team. In some sense, historically, that is true because there were a lot darker permutations of Islamic Jihad throughout 14 centuries of history.
Exactly. And see, that's, again, the point of the book. People who know history, okay, and this is what I'm trying to correct, they'll hear about, the Ottomans, and then they'll hear about the Moors in Spain, and then they'll hear about the Tatars and the, Tatar yoke or Mongol yoke of Russia. And all of these seem like disparate, historical episodes that don't have anything to do with one another. And certainly they don't have anything to do with Islam. Come on, Ottomans, they're just like any European power. They were just fighting for power and glory. Maybe they threw a couple of Islamic words out. It was just in token. And, and this is how essentially history has been taught. So that's one of the reasons I'm trying to put it as one general story. In fact, the underlying theme of the Moors in Spain, the Arabs and their invasion of North Africa, the Turkish invasion into the Balkans and the siege of Constantinople, the Tatar yoke of Russia and all that, you look at the sources, you're going to find it's all about Islam. They all do the same things that ISIS does. They all scream Allahu Akbar. They all talk about how they're going to go to heaven and copulate with the Houris, these wonderful, beautiful, supernatural women. All of them, all of these episodes are in there. They all talk about how they have to kill and destroy Christians because they're infidels. They have to break the cross. And in fact, they do break the cross and they do burn churches. All of this in every chapter of this book is manifest. And it shows you that it's one long continuum and that it transcended, designations such as the Moors or the Arabs or the Ottomans or the Tartars or the Mongols, and that it was, in fact, one long jihad. And but unfortunately, historians have just broken it up and turned it into little disparate anecdotes that are in no way, shape, or form connected to each other, when in fact it is all one long, big lump story. And that's what I hope the book will show and make clear to people.
You know what's interesting, though? If you, as Raymond Ibrahim, go to a university today and try to talk about this, there'll be a lot of people that will not engage in the free exchange of ideas. They'll probably boo you off the stage before you have an opportunity to open your mouth, and the vast majority of those booing will never have read your book to begin with.
Well, you know what? You are correct, but I'll tell you that there's a lot of dissembling going on because what you're saying has actually happened to me. But I'll give you an example. I spoke in Seattle some years back. I was invited at a college, and it was packed. There were people sitting on the floor. It was well advertised. It was packed, and but there was a woman in a burqa, or actually a niqab, or burqa, whatever you want to call it, basically long black thing covering her, sitting all the way in the back. And I got a standing ovation from everyone. She had, a question, as other people did, which was, but don't you, that I'm an Islamophobe, essentially, okay? But I felt, and so did others, it was just a 100% successful event and well received. Now, it came out in the media, and when it came out in the media on the news, the only person they had speaking was that woman. They didn't show you all the people. They showed you, it wasn't just her. There was another Muslim man who also made some comments. They only showed those two people. They didn't show you how big the crowd was. And so my point is, you're right that for sure the system is going to portray it and make you and everyone think and feel that our message is going to be booed from the start, when in fact there's so many people who are receptive to it, except but the media and the powers that be, they just suppress these people. They don't let you know they exist, and they only highlight the bad ones. And they're certainly there, and they do certainly criticize, and all you said is true, and they won't even read the book, and they'll condemn me from the start. I get all that too as well, so I'm not trying to say that that doesn't exist. I'm also saying that the good news is there's a lot who do get it, except you wouldn't know it if you follow the news because they're just completely blotted out of the picture.
And you know what I think, Raymond? I think what's happening now is things are shifting. In other words, even 6 months ago, your narrative, my narrative, would have been a narrative that is discounted, thought to be Islamophobic, thought to be out of touch with reality, all these kinds of things. But as people are seeing the effects of migration without assimilation, particularly in the EU countries, as they're seeing more and more terrorist attacks, the narrative seems to be at least gradually shifting towards what you are communicating.
Absolutely. You know, I call that, I wrote an article years back, I call it Islam's rule of numbers, which is basically, you know, it was one thing 10, 20, 30 years ago when your average American was like, Islam, huh? Muhammad who? They didn't know anything about it. They didn't feel anything from it. They weren't impacted by it. It was just at most some religion over there across the sea. But in as much as Muslims migrate into the West, into Europe and so forth, and their numbers grow, so are we going to see a purely Islamic phenomena that is, part and parcel of the Islamic world. And so now that Muslims are in large numbers in Europe, you're seeing what happens in the Middle East, Christians. You're seeing women being abducted and raped. You're seeing churches. You'd be surprised at how much the media tries to dissemble this. But churches in Germany and France are being attacked, and crosses being broken, and statues of Jesus and Mary being beheaded. And all this sort of thing is happening in London, which is, it has a Muslim mayor because it's so heavy Muslim population. You get people beheaded in the streets with a meat cleaver, screams of Allah Akbar. Well, that's not uncommon in the Islamic world. But now it's coming to the West because the numbers of Muslims are growing. And so obviously the same phenomena that belongs to them there is going to grow with them here. And I'm sorry to say, but if this is what people need to wake up, then so be it. You know, if people cannot understand it theoretically and through history or doctrine, and they must see it up close and personal, then, you know, let it happen if that's the only way for them to get it. And I think that's where we're at now. And the other thing real quick is the phenomena of ISIS. It's what ISIS has done is they're the ones who broadcast their stuff. If it was left to the mainstream media and ISIS was intentionally hiding their atrocities, we wouldn't know about it. But because ISIS likes to boast of what it's doing, they're the ones that have made this very popular. And so the mainstream media has to go along with it and just come do damage control. And so, no, this isn't Islam. But the fact is, before ISIS, Muslim organizations, including Al-Qaeda, were doing the same exact atrocities, but they didn't publicize it, and neither did the mainstream media. And so that's why all of this is like a big wake-up call to the West, and either it responds or it doesn't.
I want to turn a corner here in a minute, but you just keep stimulating with me with all these different thoughts. I mean, we think, for example, that Iran is the axis of evil along with North Korea. Talk about Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia is almost cast as though it is our best friend. And I don't know who did this. I think it was Friedman in an editorial talked about how the reason that we don't expose Saudi Arabia is because, well, those who take drugs are not going to expose their pushers. And in a sense, that's kind of what's going on. Here we have Wahhabism being exported throughout the world, hundreds of millions of petrodollars being used to do that. And it seems to me that this is at least as big a threat as ISIS.
Oh, I mean, to me, I've written articles where I call Saudi Arabia the head of the Islamic snake, the head of the Jihad. Without Saudi Arabia and its funding, we would not have ISIS. Okay, so for starters, like you pointed out, Saudi Arabia, through its petro money, spends $100 million annually disseminating what we call Wahhabi or Salafi ideologies and creating those types of mosques and spreading that kind of books and literature by the Salafi mentality, which is the ISIS mentality. There's nothing that ISIS says or believes that Saudi Arabia doesn't practice. Saudi Arabia won't allow a single church on its ground. Saudi Arabia executes the apostate and whips them. Saudi Arabia will attack and punish the blasphemer. If you're a Christian visiting Saudi Arabia as a worker and they catch you celebrating quietly Christmas in your own apartment, you will be arrested. Okay, so this is ISIS to me. And this is why I find very hypocritical when I see a politician, including Donald Trump, come and talk about how horrible ISIS is and then go dance waving swords with Saudis. Well, that's the same group, and Saudi Arabia is the one that funds and gives the most material support to groups like ISIS. And so this is why you can see we're in our predicament, because on the one hand, we can lambaste ISIS and say they're the bad guys. On the other hand, we go and sleep in the same bed with their supporters and the ones who formulated their ideology. But absolutely, I think Saudi Arabia far transcends Iran as when it comes to the question of Islam as a complete threat, because they're the ones. Without their money, this rise of Islamic terrorism is concomitant with the use of petrodollars in the 70s in Saudi Arabia and its rise on the market. It's the same story. And so until we acknowledge that and actually do something about it, well, it's just pointless talking about ISIS and this and that, because we are already, our presidents bow to, hug and kiss and dance with basically the creators of ISIS.
Yeah, really interesting. And, I wrote a book called Muslim, What You Need to Know About the World's Fastest Growing Religion. It's coming out by HarperCollins October 10th. But in that book, I start out with the story of being in Iran during the 33rd anniversary of the overthrow of the Shah of Iran. And I'd never been in a Muslim theocracy before, and so I'm a little timid. First of all, I have to hold the airline harmless. I have to sign a waiver for United Emirates, or they're not going to fly me over there. But I'm, in line and, with Muslims, and I see burqas, and it's a very uncomfortable situation for me because I'm out of my element. I get on the plane, I sit down next to this unbelievably sophisticated Muslim woman. We get in a conversation. She says, "You have any problems in Iran? Let me know. I'll help you." I deplane in Tehran, and two Muslim men kiss me on either side of the cheek, and they say salam. Then I end up going to my apartment downtown Tehran, and I don't dare come out of my room because I'm intimidated by the environment. So the next morning, my translator, Fatima, she asked me, how was your evening? I said, well, I kind of stayed in my room. She said, why? I said, well, I was intimidated. She said, you can walk the streets of Tehran in the middle of the night. No one's going to harm you. And I did that for 5 nights because of the jet lag and the time change and so forth. So I'm really throwing all this out, Raymond, because, it's so hard for me sometimes to explain the difference between people and a religion that ensnares. I honestly, and I can tell you this with no contradiction in my own mind, I don't remember a single person treating me badly in Iran. I mean, if I was trying to make change, obviously you could use a credit card, you were completely black. You could use your computer, so everything was dark. But, I'm asking people to make change for me when I'm in, let's say, the quasi-fast food restaurant in Tehran, and people are making the change for me, wanting pictures with me. So I got treated by nothing but acts of kindness. So there's a sense in which, having had that experience, and by the way, having had a tremendous experience speaking in both universities where the students were really attentive, wanted pictures with me afterwards, it seems to me when you paint that picture on the one hand, it's really hard sometimes to communicate. These are people, and many of these people are wonderful people, hospitable people, very, very different from the religion itself that ensnares them.
I'm very glad, Hank, you bring this up, because I'm in 100% agreement with you. And that's what bothers me, is the sort of lumping all. I'm a vocal opponent of Islam, the ideology and the doctrine, but I understand if you're born Muslim, doesn't mean you're foaming at the mouth and screaming jihad. And unfortunately, some people, it's an either or. It's either they're all wonderful and Islam's great, or if you're a Muslim, you're just out to destroy and kill. Obviously, there are so many shades. A lot of Muslims, after long struggles and spiritual struggles, convert, for example, from Islam to Christianity. Well, those Muslims, usually in the years before they converted, were very good people. They didn't do jihad, but they were Muslims. They were called Muslims. So there's definitely a vast continuum of different groups of individuals who are Muslims, and you cannot say if you're a Muslim you're all of a sudden a bad person. On the other hand, I would say, and I would caution, that Islam is a violent ideology, and so if a person is Muslim, well, I would approach it with some care and some caution. I would still give them possibly the benefit of the doubt. But I would not be naive, because I'll tell you this, there's a lot of Muslims who will do all those nice things that you mentioned, and it's insincere. I actually think what you recounted was sincere. The thing about Iran, and this is why Iran figures very little in my writings, is it's got its own long, rich history. Persia, it's one of the only few places that got conquered and still maintained its religion. The fact is, your average, aside from the government, the regime, and the theocracy, your average Iranian is very secular. They wear their Islam very thinly, and that's why you experience what you experienced. And that's the case in a lot of Muslim countries. You're going to come across these people. I may have mentioned this to you before, but my best analogy to make sense of all this is, the Oscar Schindler analogy of Nazism. So we denounce Nazism as an ideology. We know it's supremacist. We know it's violent. We know it's intolerant. But we also know that there were, thousands of Germans who were nominal Nazis, and they did things like Oscar Schindler. They actually put their neck on the line to help Jews and other quote-unquote undesirables to escape. These were good people. But we don't come and say that, they were moderate Nazis, therefore Nazism's okay. Don't attack all Nazism. No. We say, yeah, they were nominal Nazis, but they actually weren't living according to its precepts. And that's exactly what you're referring to. There's millions of Muslims who are nominal, who are cultural, who are otherwise good people, who don't believe in the stuff we've been talking about. But that doesn't, in my mind, exonerate Islam, just like Oscar Schindler does not exonerate Nazism. And I think people really need to understand this distinction.
I could talk to you for years, no hyperbole. I mean, you're just one of the most interesting, fascinating, and well-informed people on this crucial issue on the planet. But I want to get to your book. You're obviously a prolific writer, but I was captivated by your book. I've had you on the Bible Answer Man broadcast. Your book, Crucified Again, Exposing Islam's New War on Christians. And there are so many aspects to this book that I think are brilliant, but one of them was an insight that you had in this book that I think that most people miss, and that is there was a little lull in the storm, so to speak, between the abolishment of the caliphate by Mustafa Kemal Ataturk in 1924, I think it was June 28, there was a little lull between that and where we are now. And I think that lull of whatever it was, 90 or 100 years, that lull has given us a false sense of security with respect to Islam.
Absolutely. And, you'll be happy to know that the current book I'm writing, because it is a historical book, I actually will bring up this point again. And what you're referring to is that, so from the 7th century up until essentially the 19th or the 1800s, or let's say the 1700s, Islam's on the ascendancy, Europe's being attacked, we have the Barbary Wars, Thomas Jefferson fighting Algerian pirates who come and say, yeah, we're plundering and killing your sailors because our prophet tells us to do so. This is in 1800 and again in 1815. We have this long, constant jihad. Then all of a sudden, the European powers essentially just dominate the Islamic world in the 1800s and so forth. Napoleon, right around 1798, enters Egypt, essentially just takes it without basically even a battle, or there is a battle of pyramids. Basically Muslims at this point learn it's over. And now remember what I said about Islam. A lot of people embrace it and convert to it because of its social boons. Now, when Muslims saw that they were actually dominated by Christians and Europeans, essentially they lost faith in their religion, and a lot of them became very, very nominal, very, very watered down. And this is the golden age for Christians like Copts and so forth, because not only were they now treated equally, because Muslims and all these nations were westward looking, they were trying to westernize, so they put a religion aside. The men took off their galabeya, they shaved their beards, they put on a suit and tie. The women took off the hijab, were walking around high heels and dresses. It was a time of westernizing because that's the way you win. That's the right way, as Muslims saw. The Islamic way was the old-fashioned way. And up until 1950, there's videos of, Nasser in Egypt, Gamal Abdel Nasser laughing, and all these Egyptians laughing with him at the very thought that Egyptian women will again wear the hijab or burqa, because it's so stupid and backwards. And of course, now they're all doing it. So you had this culture which was westward-looking, and Islam was basically a footnote. And so many Muslims, look at Turkey. The Ottoman Empire was the scourge of Christendom. And in the name of Islam and in the name of the Prophet and Allah, it was all a jihad. And it was done this way on and on and on. And then what did the Turks do? These standard bearers of jihad, they're the first one who essentially abolish almost Islam. They get rid of the Arabic script, which is what they were writing their language in for centuries. They adopt the Roman Latin alphabet. And they, you have Ataturk, very westward looking, and so forth. So Islam was kind of the old way. And this goes on for 100 years, essentially. And so the problem is a lot of historians start from there. That is where history of Islam in the Western world begins. And then all of a sudden, when you see ISIS and Islamic radicalism, all of that appears as an aberration, because our starting point is a sort of moderate, watered down, very westward-leaning Islam. The problem, of course, is this view limits it just to the last century or so, and it completely ignores the early 1300 years, where Islam actually was like ISIS. And so, the point is, ISIS and these groups are not aberrations. In fact, it was that golden age, that watered-down, westward-looking Islam. That was the aberration. But unfortunately, we treat it as the starting point. And therefore, when we see ISIS, we say, oh, something went wrong.
Wow. I'm just looking through your book right now, and the pictures themselves are worth the price of the book. In some ways, it's hard to look, but you have to look. And that's something that I want to talk to you about that just can't be omitted from this discussion. Sure. Here you have, we're talking about persecution in some sense of Christians in the West, and certainly it's real. But you have pointed out and graphically portrayed what is squarely in the blind spot of the West, and that is the mass genocide that is taking place vis-a-vis Christians. Think about the Coptic Christians that were killed on the way to the monastery. That wasn't all that long ago. So many examples of Christians being crucified or being executed in some brutal way, as in beheading, or the fingertips of a father being cut off as he's watching his son being killed. I was speaking in the West Bank last year, and while I was there, heard all these stories about what is going on in terms of the elimination of Christianity in places like Gaza. I don't remember what the exact number is, but someone was saying that the number, again, I don't remember the number, but it was under 1,000 Christians left in Gaza. You're bringing to light one of the most horrendous crimes against humanity. And it seems to me that we as Western Christians oftentimes have no idea or even care or concern about what is happening to Coptic Christians. And you mentioned a whole variety of Christians in the Middle East, Slavic Christians and so forth, what's happening to them in terms of mass genocide, and this has to be brought to the fore. And I don't understand all of this, honestly, Raymond. I mean, in some ways, I think Western Christians don't even think the Copts are Christians in the first place, and therefore they don't care. I don't really know how to make sense of it, and I suppose that's why I'm reaching out to someone that was raised in this environment, or at least that's your heritage. I was born in Holland. Dutch is my first language, so that's my heritage. But this is your heritage. You understand this. These, in some way, I guess you can feel personal about. These are your people.
Right. And, you make a lot of very good points right now. I'd like to actually add to all of them. Regarding this last one, let's go back to the Crusades. These were Catholic Latins, the Crusaders, the Franks. And the people they went to help, they knew were Orthodox. The Copts are Orthodox as well. So they were going to help primarily the Byzantine Orthodox Empire. To these, and they did what you're saying today's Christians are oblivious to. They actually took it. You have to understand it, and it's so sad to see how it's been so misrepresented that these Crusaders actually were very altruistic, and in what they were doing, they knew they were going to lose their lives and not gain anything. The Jihad was about always attacking your neighbor right next to you logistically. It doesn't take a lot, and once you consolidate there, then you take the next neighbor. They marched through, 1,500 miles of harsh territory, of enemy territory, just to get to one point, Jerusalem, and to liberate it. And they went through so much trials, and people died of starvation, died from the weather, things that Muslims never did in jihad because it was much more efficient and always limited to your neighbor. That's its own thing. So we compare and contrast that with today's Christians, who you are correct. If you're, and this happens especially with a lot. I'm sorry to say, Protestant Christians. To them, Catholics and Catholics are not even Christians. Orthodox, who are they? They don't even know what that is. Eventually, they're just some funny, weird. Well, in fact, that's the oldest, denomination of Christianity. The oldest Christians come from the letters of Paul. They were sent to, Asia Minor, Greece. The first churches are all in the Middle East. The 4 of the 5 seas, one's in Rome. All the other 4 are Eastern: Constantinople, Alexandria, Egypt, Antioch, and Jerusalem. This is actually the cradle of Christianity. People don't know that the Copts actually, according to Henry Lane Poole, a 19th century historian archaeologist, actually are the ones who brought Christianity as far as to Ireland. He's written a lot about that, which I think is interesting, and I footnote it in my book. And so, there was a vibrant communication and understanding between Christian groups and all these different ones. Of course, there were the rifts and the councils and, the nature of Christ and is it this or that, and which created lots of problems as well. But today, here they are. It's these same ancient Eastern Christian groups, the Orthodox, who are being attacked, as well as Catholics, and there's Protestants also in the Middle East, converts to Protestantism, are being killed also in the same context, especially in Asia and Asian countries, as well as in Africa, because a lot of these nations were missionaries, Protestant missionaries went there. So it's not just that, Western Christians and Protestants don't care about Copts. They don't care about Protestants and Catholics who are in all rounds suffering at the hands of Islam in these different countries. And why they don't care, that's its own long topic. But I wanted to touch on something else you actually said earlier about how bad the situation is, that it's a genocide. And I think people don't understand because, again, what the media does is it only reports spectacular attacks. Like what you mentioned, the monastery, the bus, 20-some Copts were killed. Or a bombed church, which, I think 3 churches were bombed just in the last 3 and 4 months in Egypt. So spectacular attacks get mentioned. Now, what happens is if you're just following the news, you're not going to, it's okay, they get killed, but only from terrorists. And it's, once in a while. It's not an ongoing thing. The fact is, the spectacular terrorist attacks, the bombing of churches, those are the tip of the iceberg. Beneath that is an ongoing bleeding of Christians in the Islamic world, done not by terrorists, but rather by Muslim governments, Muslim individuals, Muslim mobs, Muslim whatever, okay? Open Doors, it's a human rights organization, publishes every year a report showing the 50 worst nations to be a Christian in. Habitually, 40 of the 50 are Muslim nations. And the top 10, absolute worst one, where there is, you can argue, a genocide going on against, or an ethnic cleansing at least against Christians, the top 10, 9 are Muslim. And yet, in all these 50 nations, the people persecuting the Christians are not ISIS and they're not terrorists. They are just generic, run-of-the-mill Muslims. But the sort of persecution they do is not spectacular. So it's just constant discrimination. It's kidnapping of Christian women and children. It's plundering and killing them and so forth. And that doesn't make it to the news because it's always portrayed as, oh, no, that has nothing to do with religion. That's a political thing. No, that's because of economics and or no, they're just poor. That's just a criminal act. All of these get thrown out. Yet when you dig deep, as I did for that book, in Crucified Again, you find that even all these little ones are the driving impetus is Islam and Jihad and the hate for infidels and so forth. And so I think that's one of the reasons people in the West don't really understand how deep-seated and prevalent this sort of attack on Christians is, because they're just limited to the very spectacular, one church got bombed every few months, and they don't realize this is an ongoing bleeding at the hands of all these different Muslim manifestations, from individuals to regimes to governments. Look at Saudi Arabia, our friend. I mean, that is the government of Saudi Arabia is immensely hostile to anything Christian. You will get arrested for celebrating Christmas quietly in your house and whipped. That's not ISIS. That's not quote unquote terrorists. Same thing in Egypt and Pakistan, where we were talking about girls being raped and killed because there's a culture of impunity because they're infidels, and who's going to help them against fellow Muslims? People doing this, they're just, they may be criminals, but they're justifying it because of Islamic teachings and doctrines. So it's a very deep-seated issue, and you're right, people don't get it, or they don't care. I actually think a lot of them just don't care in general. I think a lot of them don't have Christian charity, so-called Christians, because a lot of Western Christianity is something of an oxymoron to me and very much watered down. It's not the ancient Christianity preached by Christ and the apostles, which was very robust, in which people like the Crusaders believed in. They were closer in time and space to the teachings of Christ than we are. And I think today that's why a lot of Christians simply don't care, because they're just they're watered down.
It's also really interesting to me. I'm reading our local newspaper, and there's typically, at least on a fairly regular basis, a CARE spokesman who is well-spoken, someone who is erudite, is writing as a Muslim woman about, maybe the season that you're going through. Maybe it's Ramadan, or explaining to Western people, the wonders of what they do during Ramadan. The spin on it is absolutely, it makes you dizzy. I mean, you're thinking, wow, this is really wonderful. I mean, if you have no context, no knowledge, you're reading this as a Christian maybe, and you're thinking, this is really wonderful. I wonder what this wonderful group is. Maybe I should support them because they're so different from ISIS or whatever. But I think that the irony for this, Raymond, in my mind, is that so often the spokesperson is a woman, and yet the tyranny of Islam is directed at women. And sometimes I think if you want to get this message, the message that you and I are communicating across, you have to first start and say, look at what Islam has done to women, because that's being obscured in the West as well.
Oh, yeah. And, a lot of people point out that, and again, this goes back to the idea that, to me, a lot of so-called liberals, progressives, and so forth, their ultimate impetus is to denigrate Christianity. It's not any of these supposed humanitarian values that they hold. And so Western feminists will go out of their way to denounce, the patriarchal culture and throwback of Christian civilization that still remains in the West, which is nothing compared to the fact that in Islamic countries, women are essentially chattel and don't have, virtually compared to men, don't have any rights and are absolutely second, third-class citizens. This is documented in its doctrines. Muhammad is on record saying women lack in religion and brains, intelligence. Muhammad says that the majority of hell is going to consist of women. One can go on and on. A man can have 4 wives and as many women as his right hand possess, says the Quran, which means as many concubine infidels he can conquer. And yet these Western feminists, they have nothing to say about Islam because, once again, Islam is an ally in their ultimate effort to undermine Christian civilization. And so they're not going to attack it, and they're going to dissemble it, and they're going to try to portray. I mean, there's actually writings that try to present, academic writings that present Muhammad as some sort of prototypical feminist, because supposedly the Arabs, before he came around, used to bury alive their the newborn infant daughters because they didn't want daughters. Sometimes they would do that. And he banned that. And so now he's some kind of feminist. Well, that's good. I'm glad he did that. But he also inaugurated a lot of troubling things vis-a-vis women. And, that gets sidelined, ignored, whitewashed, and suppressed. And yet we find that one little thing, and whole books are written about how progressive Muhammad is. And that's why women support him, and they have nothing bad to say about Islam, and so forth and so forth. But like I said, I really believe all these progressive types, their ultimate, perhaps subconscious agenda is always to just attack the main enemy. And if Islam can be an ally in this war, then it doesn't matter if fellow women are being killed or suppressed or whatever. It can be used and set up against Christian civilization.
This might be opening a big can of worms, but my son David has been asking me this question for a long time, and I'd be interested in your take on it. It's the moniker secular Muslim. Is that an oxymoron? How would you parse that?
I would definitely call that an oxymoron. Okay, secular, as I understand it, means separate from religion. And Muslim is all about religion. So a Muslim, as we already explained, is one who submits to the teachings of Islam, which are believed to be religious. They're from a higher authority, supposedly Allah. You're supposed to fast, you're supposed to pray, you're supposed to go to Mecca, you're supposed to do jihad, you're supposed to support Muslims against infidels, and so forth. These are believed to be religious mandates that Muslims, religious people, follow. So to tell me a secular Muslim, all I can get out of that is what I was saying earlier, which is basically these cultural Muslims, whose name, his name is Muhammad, and he's from the Middle East, okay, but that doesn't mean he's reading the Quran and following it. Maybe he drinks, maybe he does all these things that are that go against Islamic teachings. So if you want to call him secular in that sense, yes, but strictly speaking, certainly it's an oxymoron.
And I think you have sort of alluded to this already, but I think it's a misnomer to call Islam a religion, at least in the Western sanitized sense of the word. Islam is a socio-political economic system that runs on the rails of Sharia. And I suppose you have a sense of this better than most. I mean, it seems to me that when Bush went into Iraq and thought, well, we're going to establish now a democracy in Iraq, that was ill-fated from the very beginning because Sharia stayed and stayed as Sharia.
Exactly. And, it's once you start believing Islam is essentially the same thing as Judaism and Christianity, it shares the same morals and ethics, and therefore, if democracy works so good in the West, obviously it will work so good in the Islamic world. Once you adopt that kind of thinking, you're doomed to failure from the start because it's all built on a false premise of the Islamic Sharia aspect. But I'm sorry, you started off saying something which I really wanted to comment. What was it? My brain just flipped right now. I just picked up on the last part about Bush, but your larger point.
So what I was talking about, and by the way, I have the senior moments all the time. You don't have an excuse. You're a lot younger than I am. But anyway, look, this is kind of an interesting phenomenon. I mean, people don't understand that Islam is not a religion in the same sense that we think of Christianity and Judaism or Buddhism being religions. I mean, it's an economic, social, political system. Right,
yeah. And what I wanted to actually say when you said that right away is what's interesting about that is historically, now this is funny, I'll show you how the academics twist things around. Historically, Christians, medieval Christians from the time of the Crusades, in their writings, basically depict Muslims as heathens or pagans because they reject Christ. But they also say they basically, and I'm paraphrasing it, they have a system, they have a law, which allows them to conquer, which allows them to oppress, which allows them to do this. So to the medieval Christian, they did not have a religion. These are just pagans, but they do have a cult-like system. Okay, now today's academics, what they do is they take that and say, you see, these Christians were so ignorant about Islam, they couldn't even see that it was a religion. They didn't understand that it was a religion, and therefore we have to discount everything they say, because in these same Christian writings, you get all the same things that we talk about, which is it teaches violence, it teaches death for God, it teaches a carnal paradise when you die, it teaches jihad. And so they use that against these Christians to say, see, they didn't even know that Islam's a religion. They actually thought it was just some cult. Obviously, we can't listen to these foolish Christians. Well, it turns out that what we're being taught is the foolish thing, and that's the impediment to our understanding of Islam, and that's why we have the George Bushes, because they believe that narrative, and they go to Iraq and try and say, okay, here we go, here's democracy. It'll work in your system as well, won't it? To me, it's ironic. The earlier Christians and medieval Europeans had a albeit incomplete, but a better sense of what Islam was all about than we do today.
I probably have to wrap this up. I'm going to wear you out and probably wear the audience out. Well, probably not going to wear anybody out because this is just fascinating stuff. You think about maybe what I started talking about at the beginning of the podcast, quoting Malcolm Muggeridge. Think about the illiberal liberalism as a threat to Western civilization. Then you also have advancing Islam in many different ways. Number one being sanitized in the West, so that when you write a book like you have written or a book like I have written, you have publishers that are sifting through that book and trying to figure out some way of making absolutely sure that they're not going to be liable in some sense for what you're saying, because the narrative is still the narrative, and the narrative has to be soft on Islam. Otherwise, it sounds as though you're an alarmist or you're a sophist, or maybe if you've engaged in sloppy journalism. So, it's kind of an interesting situation. Islam being sanitized in the West, Islam creating mass genocide with respect to Christians in the East, liberalism. You look at this whole mixture, this whole stew. Is there, in your sense, in your world, in your mind, any hope for Western civilization other than Christians once again becoming salt and light?
I'm inclined to go with what you said, the latter. Western civilization, devoid of its Christian roots, is, I believe, self-destructive and suicidal. And I think that's why we're seeing what we're seeing. It doesn't have a spiritual component. Western civilization as a secular concept is wholly materialistic. This is why all of our morality has been watered down to one premise. You can't physically hurt someone, okay? But all the morality that Christian civilization once had that transcended physically hurting someone, but, revolved around spiritually, psychologically hurting, including yourself, all that's been thrown out. And so you have this very materialistic, increasingly hedonistic civilization, which I think is still in the ascendancy because it's living off the borrowed resources of its ancestors who made it what it was. But it's swiftly being squandered left and right, and it's eventually going to go downhill. So I think void and short of a return to its spiritual roots, Western civilization is essentially done.
I got to talk about you as a person for just a moment. You put yourself on the firing line. I know what it's like to be on the firing line, having done what I've done for over 30 years. But you've really put yourself in the crosshairs. Robert Spencer, another friend of mine, has put himself in the crosshairs. And I think I'd be remiss if I didn't end this podcast by asking you a little bit about your own personal situation. It's got to be difficult. You're doing the hard work. When you write a book, like the book that you're writing right now, or Crucified Again, when you write the articles that you do, you're doing this for the benefit you're doing it for the benefit of the West, but certainly for the benefit of Western Christians. But you're on the firing line. You need the prayers of people. Be candid about your situation. It can't be easy.
No, I think my situation, if most people knew how I live, they would think it's very unenviable. But for me, it's just the way I am, and I enjoy it. I'm very, I want to boast, but I'm very scholarly and studious. I love books. I love older books. To let me sit and read for about 6 hours, that's paradise for me. So I live in I do go out of my way to, be anonymous and about where I live, and how I live. And where, where I live, my name's not on anything. I'm not on any bills or anything. It's difficult to locate me, and intentionally so. I've made it that way because I do get threats and hate mail and stuff of this sort. So basically, I live in a very kind of secluded way, but that's of my doing. I like that. I like to be surrounded with books and reading them and and writing them. And ultimately, I spent a lot of time in academia, in school. I got a master's degree in history. I was pursuing a PhD in history at some prestigious colleges, including Georgetown University and then later in Catholic University. But I really got disgusted with this ongoing whitewashing and political correctness that I constantly confronted in my classrooms and with teachers. And so basically my mission has been, I just want to get the truth out, because I do like history. I do like religion and the writing thereof and speaking about the history of religion, military history. And I believe it's such a fertile field because despite the fact that we think we know it all, most of those books out there actually preach the exact opposite of what's happened. And so I'm basically driven in getting the truth out, both contemporarily, talking about what's happening to Christians today, but also to show and to try to set the record straight about what happened yesterday, because I really believe that is the missing piece. A lot of people make the doctrinal argument, as well as myself. I say, well, look, the Quran says this, the Hadith says that. Therefore, it's a violent, intolerant religion. The problem with that argument is we live in an age where so many people will say, well, it's open to interpretation. I mean, come on, some Jews, they read the Old Testament and they still eat shellfish, or they're not all Orthodox or so forth. So it gets kind of muggy. But I think if you show a history of 14 centuries, which is unwavering and which just mirrors what ISIS and all these other groups are doing, and you find out that, no, history wasn't always good and hunky-dory, and then all of a sudden ISIS came along and it's an aberration, but rather you find out, no, ISIS is a return to the mainstream way of Islam, how it's been. I do think and hope that starts opening up people's minds, that we start moving a little bit, that we maintain the theological argument about Islam, but we also bring in the historical one, because that one is very, very muddied. And like you said, it's the reason why everything seems aberrant right now. Everything seems like it's an exception. In fact, the history shows that ISIS is the rule. So, this is who and what I am. I'm just someone who enjoys this sort of stuff intrinsically, and that's why I'm a little weird, but also am driven to a higher purpose, to try to get it out into the open, because it's the truth and it's real, and no one's doing it, or very few people are doing it. And so I feel compelled, or if you wish to say, maybe even called to, get it all out, at the risk of all these other things that sometimes I endure.
Well, I tell you, you have my undying admiration and gratitude for what you're doing. I'm just looking at the flap cover copy of your book, and I don't like to read during these podcasts, but I got to read just a couple of words from this as we close out the podcast. Christian martyrdom is not a thing of the past. For Christians across the Muslim world today, it is a burning present. In this shocking expose, Raymond Ibrahim documents the appalling sufferings of Christians from Morocco to Indonesia, from Turkey to Nigeria, everywhere, in fact, that Islamic Sharia and the culture it has shaped hold sway. Ibrahim is a Coptic Christian born and raised in America by Christian Egyptian parents. He uses his fluent Arabic, his thorough knowledge of Muslim sources, and his contacts in Christian communities across the Islamic world to uncover the truth about the outrageous abuse Christians undergo on a daily basis, and to expose and explain the otherwise unfathomable indifference of Western academia, media, and government to the greatest human rights abuse crisis of our time. And I read that only because I'm hoping that everyone that listens to this podcast gets a copy of Crucified Again. As I said, Raymond, if they just look at the pictures, it is enough to stun you such that perhaps you start at least praying for the Christians that are undergoing unthinkable, horrendous torments in the Middle East. I wear a little button that has the N. I guess it's the 14th letter of the Arabic alphabet. It's called Noon. You could probably correct me on this somewhat with your fluency, but I wear it on the lapel of my jacket if I'm wearing a jacket, or on my sweater. It's always there, and it always reminds me of the solidarity I have with my Christian brothers and sisters in the Middle East.
Well, first, just to clarify the letter thing, ISIS and other groups started around Christian homes in Iraq, and I think maybe Syria. They would put that letter, the Arabic letter, for N. And the reason they do that is the Arabic word for Christian is Nasara, starting with N, which basically most etymologies believe it just means the Nazarenes, okay, which is a misnomer, but that's what Islam calls Christians. It doesn't call them the new Arabic word Messihiyin, which means Messiahs or Christians, is a new. It was coined more recently by Arabs. So it's Nasara. So they used to put it kind of like when for the Jews, when you put a star or something and target them and tell everyone that's where they live, attack them. So that's basically what the noon is. But other than that, Hank, thank you very much for your kind words and your support, which I appreciate. And I'm glad that you give me the opportunity to talk and spread my voice to a larger audience.
Well, it's been fun talking to you and having this conversation. I hope we have many more in the future. I'm looking forward to your new book. I mean, that's got to get in the hands of people on a broad base as well. So thank you so much for this conversation. And I want to thank everybody that joined us for another episode of Hank Unplugged. And remember, if you like what you're hearing, make sure to give us a rating on iTunes and share this with your friends. This message has to get out broadly. And as you've heard today, when I say I'm talking about some of the brightest minds in the Christian world, some of the best thinkers, period, on the planet, I'm not overstating that. And certainly Raymond Ibrahim falls into that category. So again, thanks for joining us for this episode of Hank Unplugged, and make sure that you give us a rating on iTunes or wherever you consume your podcasts, and share this with your friends. Again, deeply grateful for your time. Time is precious, but I can't think of a more important discussion to have than the discussion I just had with Raymond. Hopefully it enriches your life, but also causes you to pray for our brothers and sisters who are suffering in the most incredible way. I mentioned the fingertips that are being cut off, the crucifixions. These are real things. This is not hyperbole. This is actually happening, and it's happening in real time. Once again, we're asking people to stand shoulder to shoulder with us in the battle for life and truth. More information, the books I've talked about, you can find at equip.org on the web. Again, equip.org. In fact, you can listen to this podcast on equip.org as well. Signing off for now. Look forward to seeing you with the next podcast, which will, I'm sure, be equally stimulating. So long for now.